June 23, 1942. Wehrmacht headquarters, Army Group South, occupied Ukraine. Major General Hans von Greifenberg studied the intelligence report with undisguised irritation. His staff officers had compiled complaints from frontline units about nocturnal harassment attacks that were disrupting sleep, damaging equipment, and destroying morale. The attacking aircraft were identified as obsolete Polikarpov Po-2 biplanes, wood and fabric training aircraft that belonged in museums rather than combat zones. Most disturbing to the Major General was the final line of the report. Interrogation of a captured Soviet pilot confirms that these units are composed entirely of female personnel. Von Greifenberg dismissed the report as defeatist exaggeration. Women flying combat missions was propaganda designed to humiliate German soldiers. The harassment raids were certainly real. Dozens of units reported them nightly, but attributing them to female pilots was either Soviet deception or German hysteria. What the Major General couldn't know was that 400 miles to the east, 20-year-old Senior Lieutenant Nadezhda Popova was preparing for her 43rd combat mission, one of the 852 sorties she would fly before the war's end. She and her navigator, Katya Ryabova, were checking over their Po-2 biplane, a fragile aircraft constructed of plywood, canvas and wire that predated most modern fighters by a decade. They would take off after midnight, fly to German positions at altitudes barely above treetop level, cut their engine near the target, glide silently through the darkness, release their bombs, and restart the engine while escaping into the night. They would repeat this process 5 to 8 times before dawn, returning to reload after each bombing run. The Germans called them Nachthexen, night witches, a name born from a mixture of fear, frustration and grudging respect. The creation of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment began with a letter. On September 8, 1941, as German forces advanced toward Moscow, Marina Raskova, the Soviet Union's most celebrated female aviator, received permission from Joseph Stalin himself to form 3 all-female aviation regiments. Raskova, who had set multiple long-distance flight records during the 1930s and received the Hero of the Soviet Union Award, understood that the desperate situation demanded unconventional solutions. Within weeks of the announcement, thousands of Soviet women volunteered. They came from every corner of the Soviet Union, from universities and factories, from collective farms and technical schools. Most were between 17 and 25 years old. They were mechanics, students, teachers, and engineers. What united them was determination to defend their homeland and fury at the German invasion that had destroyed their cities and killed their families. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment, designated for harassment and precision night bombing operations, received the oldest and least capable aircraft in the Soviet inventory. The Polikarpov Po-2, designed by Nikolai Polikarpov in 1927, was a primary trainer biplane constructed almost entirely of wood and fabric. It had a maximum speed of 94 miles per hour, slower than most automobiles on modern highways. Its operational ceiling was 10,000 feet, far below the altitude where most combat aircraft operated. It possessed no radio equipment, no defensive armament except the navigator's personal sidearm, no parachutes in many aircraft, and no armor protection whatsoever. Each aircraft could carry only 770 pounds of bombs, typically 6 small bombs of approximately 100 pounds each, attached to improvised racks beneath the lower wings. In any conventional assessment, these aircraft were suicide machines that had no place in modern warfare. But Marina Raskova and her second-in-command, Major Yevdokia Beshanskaya, who would lead the 588th throughout the war, recognized advantages hidden within these limitations. The Po-2's slow speed, normally a fatal weakness, became an advantage at night. German fighters designed to intercept bombers cruising at 200 miles per hour couldn't slow down enough to engage the Po-2 without stalling. When Messerschmitt Bf 109 pilots tried to match the biplane's speed, their aircraft became unstable and uncontrollable. The Po-2's wooden and fabric construction, which made it fragile, also made it nearly invisible to radar. The limited metal components reflected almost no radio waves, allowing the aircraft to approach targets undetected by the early warning systems the Germans relied upon. Most remarkably, the Po-2's open cockpit and minimal engine power enabled a tactic that would define the Night Witches and terrorize German forces. The pilots could cut their engines while approaching targets, gliding silently through this darkness. The only sound preceding the bombs was a soft whooshing noise like wind through trees or fabric rustling that gave the unit its fearsome nickname. Training began in October 1941 at Engels Military Aviation School, located on the Volga River. The conditions were brutal. Winter temperatures dropped to -40 degrees. The women trained in whatever clothing they could find, often wearing men's uniforms several sizes too large. Boots designed for male feet caused blisters and injuries. Flight suits hung loosely on smaller frames. But Major Bershanskaya, a veteran pilot who had logged over 5,000 flight hours, maintained standards that would have challenged experienced male aviators. Navigation training emphasized dead reckoning, using landmarks, compass headings, and precise timing to locate targets in complete darkness without radio aids. The women memorized terrain features from maps, learning to recognize rivers, roads, and villages from memory while flying at low altitude in darkness. They practiced emergency procedures until they became automatic reflexes. They studied German anti-aircraft tactics, learning the patterns of searchlight operations and the trajectories of flak fire. The most dangerous training involved night formation flying. The Po-2 lacked navigation lights, making it nearly invisible to other aircraft. Pilots learned to maintain formation by watching the faint glow of exhaust flames from the aircraft ahead, staying close enough to see but far enough to avoid collision. They practiced the signature tactic that would define their operations. One pilot would act as bait, flying high enough to attract searchlights and anti-aircraft fire. While the Germans focused on this decoy, 2 or 3 other aircraft would approach the target from different directions at extremely low altitude, engines idled, gliding silently toward their bombing release points. The precision required was extraordinary. Release the bombs too early, and they missed the target. Too late, and the aircraft would be caught in its own bomb blast. The margin for error was measured in seconds. By May 1942, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment deployed to the Southern Front. The unit consisted of 115 women, including pilots, navigators, and ground crew. They operated 40 Po-2 aircraft initially, a number that would fluctuate throughout the war as losses were replaced. Unlike male units that segregated pilots from mechanics and support staff, the 588th required everyone to perform multiple roles. Pilots and navigators helped service aircraft between missions. Mechanics learned navigation and sometimes flew as navigators when regular crew members were wounded. Armament specialists loaded bombs, repaired engines, and patched bullet holes in fabric wings. This flexibility proved essential to maintaining operations under the brutal conditions of the Eastern Front. The regiment's first combat missions in June 1942 revealed both the potential and the dangers of their tactics. Operating from primitive airfields near the front lines, often just cleared fields with minimal facilities, the women flew 5 to 8 sorties nightly. Each mission followed the same pattern. Take off after sunset, fly to the target area at low altitude, locate the objective using landmarks memorized from maps. Approach the target with engine idled to minimize noise. Release bombs from approximately 1,000 feet altitude. Restart the engine while diving away from the target. Return to base to rearm and refuel. Repeat until dawn. The physical demands were crushing. Summer heat in the open cockpits reached over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Winter cold plunged below -40. The women flew in these conditions for hours each night with minimal rest between missions. The psychological impact on German forces exceeded all expectations. Feldwebel Hans Joachim Marseille, a German anti-aircraft gunner stationed near Rostov, recorded his unit's experiences in a diary later captured by Soviet forces. The entries from July 1942 reveal the rapid psychological deterioration the Night Witches inflicted. July 8th. Strange attacks last night. Small aircraft, possibly trainers, dropping bombs. Searchlights can barely track them. They seem to disappear and reappear. July 12th. The night attacks continue. Men are exhausted from constant alerts. The aircraft approach silently. We hear nothing until bombs explode. Morale suffering. July 19th. 4th night without proper sleep. The aircraft come in waves. When we target one, others attack from different directions. We shoot at sounds rather than sights. Nerves are breaking. August 2nd. Men are calling them Hexen, witches. They appear from nowhere. bombs hit ammunition dumps, fuel stores, precisely the targets that cause maximum disruption. This is not random harassment. This is systematic destruction of our capability. German tactical responses proved ineffective against the Night Witch's methods. Standard anti-aircraft procedures assumed attacking aircraft would approach at altitude, maintain steady speed, and follow predictable flight paths. The Po-2 violated every assumption. They flew at altitudes between 500 and 3,000 feet, below the minimum effective range of heavy anti-aircraft guns designed to engage bombers at 10,000 feet or higher. Their slow speed made them difficult targets for automatic weapons that calculated lead based on conventional aircraft velocities. Their wooden construction didn't trigger proximity fuses that relied on metal detection. Most frustrating for German gunners, the aircraft's ability to cut engines and glide eliminated the acoustic signature that gun crews used for targeting in darkness. Searchlight operators faced equal frustration. The standard German practice concentrated multiple searchlights on a single target, creating a cone of illumination that allowed accurate anti-aircraft fire. The Night Witch's tactics deliberately exploited this concentration. When searchlights locked onto one aircraft, others would attack from opposite directions through the darkness. By the time operators shifted searchlights to the new threats, the aircraft had released their bombs and disappeared. Oberleutnant Friedrich Schmidt, commanding an anti-aircraft battery defending a supply depot near Kharkov, reported in September 1942. The female pilots demonstrate exceptional tactical awareness. They use our own searchlights against us. While we illuminate one aircraft, others strike from darkness. They know precisely where our blind spots lie and exploit them ruthlessly. Fighter interception proved equally futile. The Luftwaffe's night fighters, primarily Messerschmitt Bf-110 twin-engine aircraft equipped with radar and heavy armament, were designed to intercept bombers cruising at 200 miles per hour or faster at altitudes above 10,000 feet. The Po-2's 94 mile per hour maximum speed and operations below 3,000 feet created an impossible targeting problem. When German pilots attempted to slow their aircraft enough to maintain firing position behind a Po-2, they approached stall speed. Control became difficult, accuracy impossible. Several German night fighters crashed attempting to intercept the slow-moving biplanes. Hauptmann Josef Kochiok, an experienced night fighter pilot with 12 kills, wrote in his combat log after a failed interception attempt in October 1942, "Cannot engage these targets. My aircraft stalls at speeds where they maneuver freely. Attempted 3 approaches, nearly crashed on the second. This requires a completely different aircraft and tactics we don't possess." The few successful interceptions demonstrated the Po-2's vulnerability, but also the Night Witch's determination. On August 1, 1942, Senior Lieutenant Yevgenia Rudneva and her navigator were caught by searchlights while returning from a mission. A German fighter managed to position behind them and opened fire. The fabric-covered wings ignited immediately. Rudneva maintained control long enough for her navigator to bail out before the aircraft disintegrated. She died in the crash but saved her crew member's life. On September 24th, Sergeant Q.R. Dospanova's aircraft was hit by anti-aircraft fire that wounded both crew members and set the aircraft ablaze. Dospanova, bleeding from shrapnel wounds, flew the burning aircraft back to Soviet lines and crash-landed, saving both herself and her navigator. Both women recovered and returned to combat operations within weeks. These incidents became legendary within the regiment, establishing standards of courage that defined the unit's culture. The Night Witch's targeting demonstrated sophisticated tactical understanding that contradicted German assumptions about female pilots. Rather than randomly bombing German positions, the regiment focused on high-value targets that caused disproportionate disruption. Ammunition dumps were priority targets because their destruction forced German units to reduce combat operations until resupply arrived. Fuel depots received similar attention. A single successful strike could immobilize an entire tank battalion for days. Supply convoys traveling at night were attacked with small bombs that destroyed lead vehicles, creating traffic jams that prevented supplies from reaching the front. Command posts identified by unusual radio traffic or vehicle concentrations were targeted to disrupt German command and control. Railroad junctions and bridges received sustained attention, each successful hit multiplying delays throughout the logistics network. German commanders consistently underestimated the cumulative impact of these attacks. Each individual bombing caused relatively minor damage. 6 100-pound bombs could destroy a few trucks, kill a handful of soldiers, or damage a building, but the nightly repetition created systemic disruption that exceeded the sum of individual strikes. Units that lost sleep every night for weeks suffered deteriorating performance. Soldiers exhausted from constant alerts made mistakes. Accidents increased. Discipline deteriorated. Supply systems disrupted by nightly attacks experienced cascading delays. A destroyed bridge meant rerouting convoys, which caused traffic congestion, which delayed reinforcements, which weakened defensive positions. Ammunition shortages caused by destroyed dumps forced artillery units to ration shells, reducing fire support available to infantry. The interconnected nature of military operations meant that harassment attacks amplified throughout the system, creating disproportionate effects. By late 1942, German intelligence had confirmed that the Night Witches were indeed female pilots, not Soviet propaganda. Captured Soviet documents identified Major Yevdokia Beshanskaya as the regiment's commander. Interrogation of downed Soviet airmen confirmed that entire regiments of female pilots operated throughout the Southern Front. The German response revealed the depth of Nazi ideological blindness. Rather than adapting tactics to counter an effective enemy unit, German leadership focused on the humiliation of being attacked by women. Goebbels' propaganda ministry issued directives forbidding mention of female Soviet pilots in Communications Home, fearing the admission would damage morale. Military awards were offered for shooting down the Po-2 aircraft, the Iron Cross for any pilot who could confirm destroying 5 of the biplanes. This reward structure revealed German frustration. Fighter pilots who had achieved ace status by destroying modern Soviet fighters now pursued obsolete trainers flown by women because these slow biplanes had become the most feared threat to German ground forces. The winter of 1942 to 1943 brought conditions that should have grounded the Night Witches. Temperatures dropped below -40 degrees Fahrenheit. The Po-2's open cockpit provided zero protection from the cold. Pilots and navigators wore every piece of clothing they could find, often 4 or 5 layers, making movement in the cramped cockpit nearly impossible. Engine oil froze between missions, requiring ground crews to heat engines with fires before each takeoff. Fuel lines froze, control cables became brittle and snapped. Canvas wings stiffened in the cold, affecting aerodynamics unpredictably. Landing gear froze, making landings dangerous as wheels wouldn't turn freely. Despite these conditions, the 588th maintained operations throughout the winter, often flying more sorties during the long winter nights than in summer. Senior Lieutenant Nadezhda Popova described the winter flying conditions in post-war interviews. The cold was worse than the Germans. We wore so many layers that we could barely move. Our hands would freeze to metal parts of the aircraft. We learned to wrap cloth around anything we might need to touch. Ice would form on our faces from breath moisture. We couldn't feel our feet after the first hour. But we kept flying because we knew every night we grounded ourselves. The Germans could move supplies, reinforce positions, rest and recover. The cold was trying to kill us, but stopping would kill our comrades on the ground. The women developed innovative solutions to winter challenges. They heated engine oil in cans over fires, keeping it liquid until seconds before pouring it into the engine. They wrapped control cables with cloth soaked in alcohol to prevent freezing. They created improvised face masks from cloth and animal fur to prevent frostbite. They stuffed their boots with straw and newspaper for insulation. These adaptations kept them flying when German units often suspended operations due to weather. The Battle of Stalingrad, from August 1942 to February 1943, marked the Night Witches' transformation from harassment unit to strategic asset. As German forces attempted to capture the city, Soviet commanders recognized that the 588th's ability to operate in conditions that grounded conventional aviation made them uniquely valuable. The regiment received orders to target German artillery positions that were bombarding Soviet defenders in the city. The tactical challenge was enormous. Artillery positions were heavily defended by anti-aircraft guns specifically positioned to protect the valuable artillery pieces. They were camouflaged and frequently moved to avoid counter-battery fire. They operated primarily at night, when darkness protected them from Soviet ground attack aircraft. The Night Witches developed specialized tactics for these missions. multiple aircraft would approach the target area from different directions simultaneously. The first aircraft would drop flares, illuminating the target for following aircraft. While German anti-aircraft crews focused on the flare-dropping aircraft, others would attack from darkness, bombing the revealed artillery positions. The coordination required split-second timing and perfect navigation to ensure all aircraft arrived at the target simultaneously from different approach vectors. Senior Lieutenant Irina Sabrova, who would complete 1,008 combat missions during the war, described the artillery hunting missions. We would approach from 3 or 4 directions at once. The first crew would drop the flare and immediately dive away, drawing fire. While the Germans shot at them, we would release our bombs on the illuminated artillery. Then we would all scatter in different directions. The Germans never knew which aircraft to shoot at first. German artillery units quickly learned to fear the nights when the Night Witches hunted them. Oberst Hans Hoffmann, commanding an artillery regiment near Stalingrad, recorded in his unit diary, "The witches have forced us to relocate 3 times in 5 nights. We fire our barrage, then must immediately limbo and move before they arrive. The delay in unlimbering at the new position reduces our sustained fire capability by 40%. Several guns have been damaged in rushed relocations. Crews are exhausted from constant movement. We're being rendered ineffective not by destruction of our guns, but by forced mobility that prevents sustained fire." This was precision psychological warfare. The Night Witches didn't need to destroy every artillery piece. They simply needed to make remaining in position more dangerous than constant relocation, forcing the Germans into exhausting patterns that degraded effectiveness. The spring of 1943 brought expanded operations as Soviet forces transitioned to offensive operations. The 588th received new missions beyond harassment bombing. They began flying reconnaissance missions, using the Po-2's slow speed and low altitude to identify German defensive positions. Pilots would fly along German lines at extremely low altitude, memorizing positions of machine gun nests, anti-tank guns and strong points, then report these positions to Soviet ground commanders. They delivered supplies to partisan units operating behind German lines, landing in forest clearings to transfer ammunition, medicine and radio equipment. They evacuated wounded partisans, strapping stretchers to the lower wings for the flight back to Soviet lines. They dropped propaganda leaflets behind German lines, though pilots considered this a waste of their capabilities. The most dangerous missions involved direct support for Soviet ground attacks. When Soviet infantry assaulted German positions, the Night Witches would provide immediate fire support, bombing German trenches and machine gun positions directly ahead of advancing troops. These missions required flying at altitudes below 500 feet, often under 200 feet, making the aircraft vulnerable to small arms fire from ground troops. Sergeant Yevgenia Gigulenko completed a support mission in April 1943 that exemplified both the danger and effectiveness of these operations. Her aircraft flew at 150 feet altitude ahead of advancing Soviet infantry, bombing a German machine gun position that was holding up the advance. Ground fire hit her aircraft 42 times, destroying the lower left wing's fabric covering and damaging the engine. She maintained control and completed a forced landing in Soviet territory. The machine gun position was destroyed, allowing the infantry to advance. Gigulenko's aircraft was repaired overnight using fabric salvaged from a destroyed aircraft, and she flew 2 more missions the following night. By mid-1943, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment had become one of the Soviet Air Force's most decorated units. Multiple pilots had been awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest military decoration. The regiment had collectively flown over 10,000 combat sorties. They had dropped over 3,000 tons of bombs on German positions. German intelligence estimated they had destroyed or damaged over 17 armoured vehicles, 86 vehicles, 2 ammunition depots, 12 fuel depots, 26 boats, 9 trains, 2 railway stations, 46 buildings, and several hundred German soldiers. These statistics, while impressive, failed to capture the regiment's true impact. The psychological disruption, the degraded performance of exhausted German units, the cascading effects of disrupted supply systems, these effects multiplied far beyond the direct destruction the bombs inflicted. German tactical adaptations in 1943 demonstrated growing respect for the Night Witches' capabilities. anti-aircraft units received specialized training for engaging low-altitude, slow-moving targets. Searchlight operators practiced rapid switching between targets to counter the multiple aircraft approach tactic. Fighter squadrons received obsolete biplane fighters, including captured Soviet Po-2 aircraft, specifically to counter the Night Witches at their own altitude and speed. The Luftwaffe established dedicated night harassment squadrons, Sturmkampfstaffeln, equipped with slow aircraft like the Arado R-66 and Gothigo 145 biplanes to harass Soviet positions using the same tactics the Night Witches pioneered. This imitation represented the sincerest form of respect. The Germans were copying tactics developed by female pilots they had initially dismissed as propaganda. The summer of 1943 brought the Kursk offensive, the largest tank battle in history. The 588th relocated to airfields near the Kursk salient, with orders to attack German armour concentrations. The challenge seemed impossible. The Po-2's small bombs couldn't penetrate tank armour, but Major Bashanskaya understood that tanks, while heavily armoured, required vulnerable support systems. Fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, and maintenance vehicles were soft targets that tanks couldn't function without. The regiment focused on these logistics targets, bombing fuel convoys and ammunition dumps that supported the armoured formations. A tank without fuel and ammunition became an expensive roadblock rather than a weapon. Senior Lieutenant Rufina Gasheva, who flew 848 combat missions during the war, described the anti-tank operations at Kursk. We couldn't destroy the tanks directly, but we could starve them. We would find their fuel dumps and supply convoys. 6 bombs couldn't destroy a panzer, but they could destroy the truck carrying the fuel the panzer needed. We would watch for the secondary explosions that told us we had hit fuel or ammunition. The Germans learned to disperse their supplies, but that made resupply slower and more complicated. We were fighting their logistics, not their armour. German tank commanders confirmed the effectiveness of these tactics. Hauptmann Otto Carius, one of Germany's most successful tank commanders with over 150 tank kills, wrote in his memoirs about operations at Kursk, "The Soviet female pilots, the Night Witches, caused us constant problems, not because they could destroy our tanks, but because they destroyed everything our tanks needed to operate. They would hit our fuel trucks, our ammunition carriers, our repair vehicles. We would reach an attack position only to discover we couldn't advance because supplies hadn't arrived. The night attacks had destroyed them." The autumn of 1943 saw the 588th supporting the Soviet advance through Ukraine. The regiment's operational tempo increased to levels that would have destroyed conventional units. Pilots regularly flew 8 to 10 sorties per night, spending 6 to 8 hours in the air in an open cockpit. They would land, refuel and rearm in less than 10 minutes, then take off again. Senior Lieutenant Yevgenia Rudneva, one of the regiment's most accomplished navigators, flew 645 sorties before her death in April 1944, maintaining a journal throughout her service that provided historians with detailed accounts of daily operations. Her entry from October 15, 1943 described a typical night. 9 sorties tonight. First mission at 22:10 hours targeting German ammunition dump near Melitopol. Heavy anti-aircraft fire. Searchlights very active. Second mission at 23:15, same target. Secondary explosions confirmed previous hit. Third mission at 0020. New target German supply convoy. Fourth mission at 0135. Supporting ground attack. 5 through 9 missions blur together. Exhaustion making navigation difficult. Using star positions and terrain features. Last landing at 0520 hours. Debriefing at 0600. Sleep until 1200. Aircraft maintenance afternoon. Mission briefing at 1900. Again, tonight. This operational tempo destroyed both aircraft and pilots. The Po-2 was never designed for sustained combat operations. Wings weakened from bullet holes and stress. Engines wore out from constant running. Control surfaces developed play in their linkages. Canvas covering deteriorated from weather and age. The regiment's maintenance crews, all women, performed miracles keeping the aircraft flying. They would completely recover wings overnight, stripping old fabric and installing new canvas by dawn. They rebuilt engines using parts cannibalized from destroyed aircraft. They fabricated replacement parts when official supplies were unavailable. They patched bullet holes with fabric glued in place with improvised adhesives. These mechanics understood that their pilots' lives depended on their work, creating standards of maintenance that exceeded regulations. The human cost mounted throughout 1943 and 1944. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment lost 32 pilots and navigators killed in action during the war, approximately 1/4 of the unit's strength. These losses came not from overwhelming enemy action but from the accumulated risks of flying obsolete aircraft in combat conditions night after night for years. Lieutenant Yevgenia Nikulina and her navigator were killed in May 1943 when their aircraft was hit by ground fire and crashed. Lieutenant Polina McCogan died in July 1943 when her Po-2 collided with a searchlight mast during a low-altitude approach. Navigator Vera Tarasova was killed in August 1943 when her aircraft was caught by a German night fighter. Senior Lieutenant Yevgenia Rudneva, whose navigation skills had made her one of the regiment's most valuable members, died on the last day of her combat tour in April 1944 when her aircraft was shot down during the liberation of Crimea. Each loss devastated the close-knit regiment. Unlike large bomber units where crew members might not know pilots from other squadrons, the 588th's small size meant everyone knew everyone. Pilots and navigators had trained together, flown together, lived together for years. When an aircraft failed to return, the entire regiment felt the loss personally. Major Bashanskaya understood that maintaining morale required honouring the fallen while preparing surviving crews to continue the mission. Memorial services were brief but meaningful. The deceased's belongings would be packed and prepared for shipment to families. Their names would be entered into the regiment's roll of honour. Then operations would continue because the mission demanded it and the dead would have wanted it. The winter of 1943 to 1944 marked the Night Witch's operational maturity. They had evolved from an experimental unit flying harassment missions to an indispensable component of Soviet offensive operations. Their tactics, developed through trial and error over hundreds of combat missions, had been refined to devastating effectiveness. Their ability to operate in conditions that grounded conventional aviation made them uniquely valuable during the mud season of spring and the blizzards of winter when weather limited other air operations. Soviet ground commanders specifically requested Night Witch support for difficult operations, knowing these women could deliver precision strikes regardless of weather or darkness. The liberation of Crimea in April and May 1944 demonstrated the Night Witch's evolution into a precision strike force. The German 17th Army, trapped on the Crimean Peninsula, fought desperately to hold defensive positions while evacuation by sea removed troops and equipment. The 588th received orders to prevent this evacuation by attacking the ports where German ships loaded troops and supplies. The missions required flying over water at night, navigating by compass and timing to locate ports, bombing ships and dock facilities, then finding their way back to base over featureless ocean. Navigation errors meant flying until fuel exhaustion and crashing into the Black Sea. The margin for error was zero. Senior Lieutenant Irina Sabrova, who flew multiple missions during the Crimean operation, described the challenge. Flying over water at night with no visual references except stars was terrifying. We navigated by compass heading and speed calculations, updating position constantly. Miss the target by 5 degrees and you end up over empty ocean with no way to know where you are. We learned to use the angle of moonlight on water to estimate position. We watched for ships' wakes that showed German evacuation routes. We bombed the ships themselves when we could find them, aiming for the white foam of their wakes in darkness. The German evacuation suffered severe disruption. Multiple ships were damaged or sunk by the small bombs. Port facilities were repeatedly hit, slowing loading operations. German casualties mounted as Night Witch attacks caught troops concentrated at embarkation points. The summer of 1944 brought Operation Bagration, the massive Soviet offensive that destroyed German Army Group Center. The 588th relocated to Belarus, supporting the rapid Soviet advance that liberated Minsk and pushed German forces back into Poland. The operational tempo reached levels that tested the limits of human endurance. Some pilots flew 12 sorties in a single night, spending 10 hours in the air. The physical demands were crushing. Dehydration from breathing dry air at altitude, exhaustion from constant vibration and engine noise, muscle fatigue from hours of fighting control, stick forces and turbulence. Yet the women maintained this pace for weeks as the offensive rolled westward. The advance into Poland and eventually Germany itself in 1945 brought new challenges. German anti-aircraft defences intensified as the war neared German territory. Fighter interceptions increased as the Luftwaffe concentrated remaining forces to defend the Reich. The Night Witches adapted by flying at even lower altitudes, often below 100 feet, using terrain features for concealment. They accepted greater risks because they understood the war was approaching its end and maximum pressure on German forces would hasten final victory. The last month saw some of the fiercest combat the regiment experienced. On the night of May 4th, 1945, just days before Germany's surrender, Senior Lieutenant Nadezhda Popova flew her final combat mission, her 852nd sortie. She and her navigator bombed a German position in Austria, dropped propaganda leaflets announcing Germany's imminent defeat, and returned safely to base. When word of Germany's surrender reached the regiment on May 8th, the women who had fought for nearly 4 years wept with relief, exhaustion, and grief for the 32 comrades who hadn't survived to see victory. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment's combat record exceeded all expectations. During 1,134 days of combat operations from June 1942 to May 1945, the unit flew 23,672 combat sorties, the most of any Soviet aviation unit. They dropped approximately 3,000 tons of bombs on German positions. 23 pilots and navigators received the Hero of the Soviet Union decoration, the highest military award. The entire regiment received the designation Guards, an honorary title reserved for elite units. Individual pilots achieved extraordinary records. Senior Lieutenant Irina Sebrova flew 1,008 missions. Senior Lieutenant Nadezhda Popova completed 852 sorties. Navigator Yevgenia Rudneva flew 645 missions before her death. These numbers represented not just statistics, but thousands of hours in open cockpits, thousands of approaches into German anti-aircraft fire, thousands of moments when death was one mechanical failure or one German bullet away. The psychological impact on German forces was documented in countless after-action reports, diaries, and post-war testimonies. The Night Witches had achieved their mission not primarily through the physical destruction their small bombs caused, but through the systemic disruption and psychological stress their relentless nightly attacks inflicted. German units that faced them experienced documented declines in combat effectiveness due to chronic sleep deprivation. Supply systems disrupted by nightly attacks never recovered full efficiency. The knowledge that obsolete aircraft flown by female pilots could attack with impunity damaged German morale and reinforced the growing awareness that the war was lost. German General Johannes Friesner, who commanded forces that faced the Night Witches, wrote in his post-war memoirs, "The female Soviet pilots in their obsolete biplanes were a greater threat to my forces' combat effectiveness than many more powerful Soviet units. They attacked every night without fail, regardless of weather. They caused limited physical damage but unlimited psychological damage. My men became exhausted, nervous, and demoralized. Soldiers who could face Soviet tanks without flinching became fearful at sunset, knowing the Witches would come. This was warfare we had no counter for because it exploited every weakness in our defensive systems while negating every advantage we possessed." The Night Witches' success challenged fundamental assumptions about women in combat that persisted in militaries worldwide. They demonstrated that in appropriate roles with proper training, female personnel could achieve combat effectiveness equal to or exceeding male counterparts. They proved that technological sophistication mattered less than tactical innovation, determination, and courage. They showed that underestimated opponents operating with limited resources could achieve strategic effects through creative exploitation of their strengths and enemy weaknesses. These lessons, learned at tremendous cost, would influence military doctrine for decades after the war. After Germany's surrender, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment continued operations briefly during the Soviet-Japanese War in August 1945, flying missions against Japanese forces in Manchuria before Japan's surrender ended World War II. The regiment disbanded in October 1945, its members demobilizing to return to civilian life. For many veterans, the transition proved difficult. Women who had commanded aircraft in combat returned to a peacetime Soviet society, that expected them to resume traditional female roles. Their extraordinary military service was celebrated in state propaganda but often dismissed or minimized in personal interactions. Many veterans faced skepticism from male colleagues who couldn't believe women had flown combat missions. Some chose not to discuss their wartime service to avoid confrontation. Dezhda Popova, who survived 852 missions, including being shot down twice, burning alive in a crash, and bailing out over enemy territory, returned to work as a flight instructor. She married another decorated pilot, also a hero of the Soviet Union, and raised a family while continuing to fly until age 70. In interviews later in life, she reflected on her wartime experience. "We were young women, most of us barely out of school. We flew obsolete aircraft that were dangerous even without Germans shooting at us. Every night we knew we might not return. But we never considered not flying. Our country faced extinction. Every mission we flew, every bomb we dropped, every German position we disrupted contributed to victory. We were women, but we were warriors, and we did our duty." Marina Raskova, the aviation pioneer who created the female aviation regiments, didn't live to see the victory she made possible. She died in a flying accident in January 1943, but her vision transformed Soviet military aviation and proved that with proper training and opportunity, women could excel in any military role. Major Yevdokia Beshanskaya, who commanded the 588th throughout the war and maintained the discipline and tactical innovation that made the Night Witches effective, continued military service until 1946. She maintained contact with her former pilots for decades, organizing reunions and ensuring their achievements were remembered and documented. When she died in 1982, veterans from across the Soviet Union attended her funeral, honoring the commander who had led them through the war and brought more of them home than anyone thought possible. The full story of the Night Witches remained obscure in the West for decades after the war. Cold War tensions meant Soviet military achievements received limited recognition in Western histories. The few accounts that mentioned female Soviet pilots often dismissed them as propaganda or minimized their effectiveness. It wasn't until the 1990s, after the Soviet Union's collapse, that Western historians gained access to Soviet military archives and could verify the extraordinary reality of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. Interviews with surviving veterans, combat records, and German documents all confirmed what had seemed too remarkable to believe. Young Soviet women flying obsolete biplanes had conducted one of the most effective harassment campaigns in military history. The German perspective on the Night Witches evolved dramatically from dismissal to respect to something approaching awe. Early in the war, German soldiers joked about being attacked by women, treating it as humiliating propaganda rather than serious threat. By 1943, frontline troops no longer joked. They built deeper bunkers, improved camouflage, and requested more anti-aircraft guns specifically to counter the nocturnal attacks. By 1944, German tactical doctrine included specific procedures for countering low-altitude night attacks, with the Night Witches serving as the primary example of the threat. By 1945, veteran German soldiers spoke of the Night Witches with the same respect they accorded elite Soviet Guards units, recognizing them as formidable opponents who had contributed significantly to German defeat. The technical limitations of the Po-2 biplane, which initially seemed to guarantee failure, became advantages that the Night Witches exploited brilliantly. The aircraft's slow speed that made it vulnerable to modern fighters also made it impossible for those fighters to intercept effectively. Its fabric and wood construction that provided no armor protection also made it nearly invisible to radar and difficult to damage with proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells designed to explode near metal aircraft. Its minimal bomb load that seemed inadequate for serious military effect proved perfectly sufficient for precision attacks on high-value targets where 6 100-pound bombs caused disproportionate damage. Its open cockpit that exposed pilots to brutal weather also provided unobstructed visibility, essential for navigation and target identification in darkness. Every apparent weakness became a tactical advantage when employed by skilled pilots who understood their aircraft's capabilities and limitations. The navigational skills the Night Witches developed were extraordinary even by modern standards. Flying at low altitude in darkness without radio aids, often in weather that grounded other aircraft, they located targets using dead reckoning, terrain recognition, an intuitive understanding of wind drift and aircraft performance. Senior navigators could calculate compass headings in their heads, estimate time to target based on observed ground speed, and identify their position to within a few hundred meters using only landmarks glimpsed briefly in darkness. These skills required mathematical ability, spatial reasoning, and mental discipline that exceeded what most military training programs developed even in peacetime. That these women developed such skills while flying combat missions under German fire demonstrated both natural ability and determination to master their craft. The ground crews who maintained the Po-2 aircraft demonstrated equal heroism in different form. These women, mostly teenagers and young adults trained in mechanics, worked in primitive conditions to keep obsolete aircraft flying at operational rates that exceeded peacetime standards. They worked through winter nights in temperatures below -40 degrees, with minimal tools and inadequate parts. They repaired aircraft damaged by ground fire using improvised materials and creative engineering, and they performed engine overhauls in darkness, using flashlights when electric lights were unavailable. They built improvised bomb racks when official equipment was damaged. They trained themselves to identify mechanical problems by sound and feel when diagnostic equipment wasn't available. A single overlooked mechanical issue, a fuel line not properly secured, a control cable fraying under stress, could kill an entire crew. These mechanics understood this responsibility and accepted the crushing pressure of knowing that pilots' lives depended on their work. The recognition these women received during the war varied by period and political climate. In 1942 and 1943, Soviet propaganda celebrated the Night Witches as examples of female heroism and Soviet determination. They were featured in newspapers, radio broadcasts, and films. Their achievements were presented as evidence of socialism's superiority over fascist systems that confined women to subordinate roles. By 1944 and 1945, as Soviet forces approached victory, propaganda emphasis shifted to male combat units and the leadership of Stalin. Female aviation units received less publicity despite maintaining the same operational tempo and effectiveness. After the war, veterans found themselves celebrated in state ceremonies but marginalized in personal and professional contexts. The Soviet system valued their wartime service symbolically, while often denying them career opportunities and recognition in practice. Many veterans reported that their military decorations and combat experience meant little when seeking post-war employment or advancement. The Night Witches' achievement must be understood in the context of Soviet wartime aviation operations that saw extreme losses across all units. The Soviet Air Force lost approximately 106,000 personnel killed during the war, the highest aviation casualties of any combatant nation. Aircraft losses exceeded 47,000. These staggering numbers reflected both the intensity of combat on the Eastern Front and the Soviet tactical approach that accepted high casualties in pursuit of mission success. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment's loss rate of approximately 25% killed was actually lower than many Soviet aviation units despite flying obsolete aircraft. This suggests that their tactics, while dangerous, were actually more survivable than conventional bombing operations. The slow speed and low altitude that seemed to make them vulnerable actually provided advantages. They were below the altitude where heavy anti-aircraft fire was effective. They were too slow for fighter interception. They could use terrain masking unavailable to high-altitude bombers. Their tactics, developed through necessity from flying inadequate aircraft, proved more survivable than conventional methods. The final missions flown by the Night Witches in April and May 1945 carried symbolic significance beyond their military impact. These women who had begun the war as young students, teachers, and workers, who had volunteered when their nation faced potential extinction, who had survived years of combat that killed thousands of Soviet aviators, were still flying their obsolete biplanes into German gunfire as the war reached its conclusion. They had witnessed the entire arc of the Eastern Front, from desperate defense through grinding attrition to final victory. They had bombed German forces across thousands of miles from Ukraine to Austria. They had adapted to every German countermeasure and overcome every challenge their obsolete equipment presented. They had proven themselves among the most effective units in Soviet service. As they flew their final missions and learned of Germany's surrender, they understood they had contributed essential service to their nation's survival an ultimate triumph. By any objective measure, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment succeeded brilliantly at a mission that seemed impossible when they began operations in June 1942. The story of the Night Witches stands as one of World War II's most remarkable achievements and one of military history's most compelling examples of how determination, innovation and courage can overcome technological inferiority and societal prejudice. These young Soviet women who flew obsolete biplanes into German gunfire night after night for years proved themselves warriors equal to any in history. They earned their victories through skill, sacrifice and sustained courage under conditions that would have broken most military units. They transformed from students and workers into the most decorated Soviet aviation unit. They defeated German forces that had conquered most of Europe. They survived a war that killed millions of their countrymen, and they did it all while flying aircraft that should never have survived one combat mission, let alone 23,672.